Of all the characters in Warhammer 40,000, there is one Primarch who is arguably more famous than Vulcan, more mysterious than the Lion once was, more discussed than some of the Demon Primarchs. A Primarch who has no name, no face, no confirmed history, no surviving dialogue, no model, no novel, no official artwork, and yet somehow remains one of the most fascinating figures in the entire setting. The second Primarch, one of the lost Primarchs, one of the forgotten and the purged, and perhaps the greatest mystery Games Workshop has ever created. Now, before we begin, there is something important to establish immediately. We do not know who the second Primarch was. Nobody does. Not really. There are theories, thousands of them, some plausible, some completely ridiculous. A few that probably require the author to stare at the conspiracy board for several weeks without sleep. But the truth is that Games Workshop has deliberately never answered the question. The Lost Primarchs were created as an unsolved mystery, something ancient and unknowable buried deep within Imperial history. Even decades later, that mystery remains intact. And honestly, I think this is a smart decision by them. Because the second Primarch is fascinating precisely because we don't know him. In fact, I'd argue that the mystery itself is the character. This does sound quite strange, but bear with me. When people discuss the second Primarch, they're often trying to solve the puzzle. I'm more interested in what the puzzle actually means, because the existence of the Lost Primarchs tells us something extremely important about the Emperor himself. It tells us he was willing to erase one or more of his sons completely. Not kill them, but erase them from existence. There's a difference here. Death is one thing, history is another. The Imperium remembers Horus, it remembers Magnus Angron, it remembers the heresy. The Traitor Primarchs are hated, but they still exist within the historical record. But the second Primarch does not. His memory was condemned, his legion dismantled, his name removed. His achievements deleted from existence. His very existence became forbidden knowledge, in fact. Think about how extraordinary this really is. Horus almost destroyed humanity. Magnus shattered the Emperor's greatest project. Angron and the other traitors butchered entire systems and worlds. Yet all of them remain part of Imperial history. Whatever happened to the second Primarch was considered so serious that complete obliteration became the preferred solution. That should immediately make people pay attention, because it suggests to me something deeply unusual occurred here. One of the most interesting details we know is that the other Primarchs remembered him, or rather, they remembered forgetting him. There are scattered references throughout the Horus Heresy novels where characters acknowledge the Lost Primarchs existed but refuse to elaborate. Sometimes because they can't, sometimes because they've sworn not to, sometimes because their memories have literally been altered. And I found this detail fascinating. Imagine being Rogel Dawn. Imagine knowing you once had another brother. Imagine knowing something happened to them. And imagine knowing you deliberately chose to forget them. It is an unsettling thought. There is that scene involving Malcador and Dawn that's always stuck with me. One of those things that you never forget really in Warhammer. Dawn briefly regains knowledge of the Lost Primarchs and is shaken by what he sees. When the memories are removed again, he accepts that the decision had been necessary for the survival of the Imperium. Now, that doesn't tell us anything of what actually happened, but it does tell us something important. The Lost Primarchs were not forgotten because somebody had a bad day. This was not an administrative dispute. This was not a disagreement over tactics. Something happened that convinced some of the greatest minds in the Imperium that total erasure was preferable to remembrance. And this is a frightening implication, to be frank. And then there is another clue that often gets overlooked. The second Primarch appears to have been discovered relatively early during the Great Crusade and served for a significant period before his downfall. He wasn't a forgotten experiment hidden away in a laboratory somewhere. He commanded his legion. He fought beside his brothers. He participated in Imperial history before being removed from it. Which means that Guilliman knew him. Horus, Sanguinius, the Lion, they all knew him for decades, perhaps even a century. Imagine that. Imagine an entire Primarch-sized hole in history. A brother standing in every family portrait whose image has been cut away. That's what the second Primarch feels like, an absence. And sometimes absences tell us more than presence. One of the theories that has always interested me the most is not what he did, but why his story feels different from the Traitors. Because whenever the Lost Primarchs are mentioned, characters rarely speak about them in the way they speak about Horus. There is sadness and regret, tragedy even, almost never a hatred. I've always found this curious. Leman Russ, for example, appears to regard at least one of the Lost Primarchs as a tragic figure rather than a villain. Rogel Dawn similarly reflects upon their fate as a warning rather than simply an act of treachery. This distinction matters obviously, because it suggests the second Primarch may not have been evil at all. Perhaps he failed. Perhaps he was corrupted by something unknown. Perhaps he discovered something he shouldn't have. Perhaps he represented a threat that could not be allowed to continue. We simply don't know, and I suspect we never will. Which brings us to what I think is the most interesting aspect of the character, his significance. Not his actions, of which we know little, his actual significance. Because the second Primarch serves a very specific role within Warhammer. He proves that the Imperium lies. Now I realise it's hardly a shocking revelation. The Imperium lies about all sorts of things, usually before breakfast and after, but this is different. The Lost Primarchs demonstrate that Imperial history is not merely incomplete, it is actively manufactured, edited and curated. Entire lives can be removed if they become inconvenient. Entire truths can disappear. The Imperium presents itself as eternal and unchanging, yet right at its foundation sits a secret so large that nobody is allowed to discuss it. This is enormously important thematically for me. The second Primarch represents forbidden history. The idea that truth itself can be altered and changed, it is dangerous. In many ways, he is less a person and more a warning. A reminder that even the Emperor's grand narrative contains missing pages. And perhaps that's why fans remain obsessed with him. Not because they expect an answer, but because they know the answers probably don't exist. The mystery itself is more compelling than any solution ever could be for me. Imagine Games Workshop announced tomorrow that the second Primarch's name was Bob. He enjoyed gardening, he had a disagreement with the Rangdan, and then he exploded. Nobody would be satisfied with any answer. The mystery would instantly become smaller, less interesting, less powerful. The unknown is carrying enormous weight here. It's doing the work of the mythology, and the mythology thrives in the darkness. The funny thing is that among all 20 Primarchs, the second may be the one who best embodies the setting itself. Warhammer is built on lost knowledge, forgotten empires, ancient secrets. Buried truths, if you like. Nobody fully understands the Warp, the Emperor, the Dark Age of technology, and nobody fully understands the second Primarch, in the least bit. He sits at the centre of all these mysteries like a missing piece from a puzzle that was never meant to be completed. Which brings me to my final thought on this really. People often ask who the second Primarch was. Personally, I think it's more interesting to question what he represented. To me, he represents possibility. The possibility that even the Emperor could fail, the possibility that some truths are too dangerous to preserve, the possibility that history itself can be wounded, rewritten. And perhaps most importantly, the possibility that not every mystery needs a solution, and also not everything that you think you know is correct. Because in a setting where we know the fate of Horus, the sacrifice of Sanguinius, the return of Guilliman and the awakening of the Lion, there is something strangely refreshing about one question remaining unanswered. 10,000 years have passed, the Imperium has risen and decayed. Primarchs have fallen and returned, gods have been born, galaxies have burned. And still the second Primarch remains exactly where he's always been, just beyond our reach, a ghost in the Imperial family. a missing brother whose absence has become more significant than most characters' entire histories, and perhaps that is the greatest achievement of all. The second Primarch may be the only Primarch whose story became legendary precisely because it was never told. If there's one Primarch who embodies the central tragedy of Warhammer 40,000 better than almost any other, it is Fulgrim, the third Primarch of the Emperor's Children. Not Horus, not Magnus, not Mortarion, I would say it's Fulgrim. Because Fulgrim's story is not really about corruption at all. It's about obsession, and there is a difference. Corruption implies something external, a poison entering the system, an outside force twisting somebody into something they were never meant to be. Obsession is different. It grows from within. It begins as a strength, a virtue, a quality that people admire, and then slowly, almost invisibly, it becomes something darker, something unhealthy, something consuming. That is Fulgrim's story. And what makes it so compelling is that unlike many of his brothers, Fulgrim was never chasing power. He was chasing perfection. The problem was that perfection doesn't exist, and eventually that pursuit destroyed him. To understand Fulgrim, you have to begin with Chemos, of course, because much like Caliban explains the lion and Fenris explains Russ, Chemos explains Fulgrim. Chemos was dying. Not dying dramatically, not being invaded by demons or consumed by alien horror. It was simply fading away. Its resources were exhausted, industry failing. Its population survived through discipline and sacrifice only. Every citizen was expected to contribute. Waste was unacceptable. Mediocrity was not allowed. Everything had to serve a purpose. The world could not afford anything less. And into that environment arrived Fulgrim, a child who would quickly become the greatest leader Chemos had ever known. I've always found it interesting that Fulgrim's early life rarely receives the attention it deserves, really. Because before he became the Phoenician, before he became a demon Primarch, before he became the poster child for making catastrophically poor life choices, he was genuinely extraordinary. Not simply because he was a Primarch, because he cared. He worked, he built, he improved the lives of ordinary people. The young Fulgrim wasn't dreaming about conquest. He was trying to save his world. And he succeeded. This is an important part of his character, because it tells us something fundamental about him. Fulgrim wasn't born arrogant, he wasn't born selfish, he wasn't born corrupted. He was ambitious, and there is a difference here. People often confuse ambition and arrogance. In reality, they're not the same thing at all. Ambition says, I can be better. Arrogance says, I already am. Early Fulgrim was driven by the first for sure. The tragedy is that he eventually fell into the second. By the time the Emperor arrived, Chemos had been transformed. Its industries recovered, its people prospered, its future seemed secured. The Emperor looked upon his son and found exactly what he had hoped for. A builder, a leader, a visionary. Yet there was already something unusual about Fulgrim, something that would eventually define his entire existence. Nothing was ever enough for him. Not in an unhealthy sense initially. In fact, it was often admirable. If a weapon could be improved, Fulgrim would improve it. If a strategy could be refined, he would refine it. If a city could be made more beautiful, he would do it. His standards were extraordinary, and because he was a Primarch, he often achieved those standards. That's the dangerous thing about him, really. His obsession worked, at least for a while. Most people eventually learn the limits of perfection because reality forces them to. Fulgrim spent much of his life succeeding again and again. Victory reinforced the behavior, achievement reinforced the obsession. Every success whispered the same message. Keep going, push harder, aim higher, demand more. Perfection was always just around the corner for him. The Emperor's Children became an extension of this, of course. I've always thought they were one of the most fascinating legions before their fall. Not because they were the strongest, because they genuinely wanted excellence. There was a nobility in the way that they carried themselves. The Emperor's children sought mastery in everything: warfare, craftsmanship, culture, art. They wanted humanity to become greater. They genuinely valued all of these things. They wanted to be better, more refined. People sometimes forget that before they became monsters, the Emperor's children were perhaps the most idealistic legion in the Imperium. And at their centre, of course, stood Fulgrim, a Primarch who genuinely believed humanity could achieve greatness. One thing I find fascinating is how much Fulgrim differs from many of his brothers. Russ understood strength, Dawn understood duty, Guilliman understood order, the Lion, survival. Fulgrim understood human beauty. Now, I know this sounds trivial, but you have to think about it properly. Beauty, art, culture, these things create civilization. They depend on it, in fact. Civilizations are remembered not only for their victories, but for what they create. Fulgrim understood this instinctively. There is a reason he became close friends with Ferrus Manus. Both men appreciated craftsmanship, mastery. Both believed that creating something exceptional had value. The difference was that Ferrus understood the limits of reality, and Fulgrim did not. This distinction ultimately destroyed them. The friendship between Ferrus and Fulgrim may be one of the most important relationships in the whole heresy, because Ferrus was one of the few people capable of challenging Fulgrim honestly, one of the few people who could tell him he was wrong, one of the few people whose approval genuinely mattered. I've often thought that Ferrus represented something Fulgrim desperately needed: a sense of perspective, someone capable of reminding him that perfection wasn't everything, someone capable of grounding him. Which is why Istvan V remains so heartbreaking, not simply because Ferrus dies, because Fulgrim kills the person who might have saved him. And after that, the descent becomes inevitable. Now, whenever people discuss Fulgrim's corruption, attention inevitably turns to the Leia blade, the infamous demon weapon, the cursed sword, the object that accelerated his fall. And yes, the blade obviously absolutely did matter, but I think people sometimes give it too much credit. The sword didn't create Fulgrim's flaws, it just exploited them. Much in the same way that chaos always does, really. It's a crucial difference. Chaos is rarely at its most effective when it creates weaknesses. Chaos is effective when it discovers a weakness that already exists. Fulgrim already wanted perfection. He already wanted transcendence. He already believed ordinary limitations should be overcome. The blade simply whispered that those desires were justified. And then it whispered they could be taken further, then further still, until eventually nothing was left of him. This is why I think Fulgrim is one of the most tragic Primarchs for me, because even as he falls, you can still understand him. You still get to see the original motivation, the desire to improve, the desire to be better, the desire to achieve something extraordinary. Those instincts never disappear, they simply become warped. In fact, they're incredibly human, as many of the Primarchs turned out to be, really. By the time Fulgrim ascends to demonhood, he has become the ultimate expression of excess, a servant of Slaanesh, a creature so consumed by sensation, perfection, and desire, he is completely unrecognizable. And yet, strangely, I don't think he's ever achieved what he wanted. This is the great irony. Perhaps the greatest irony in his entire story. Fulgrim spent his life pursuing perfection, then pledged himself to a god that ensures perfection can never be reached. Slaanesh doesn't offer satisfaction. Slaanesh offers an appetite. The moment one desire is fulfilled, another emerges. The moment one achievement is secured, a greater achievement becomes necessary. The finish line forever moving beyond the horizon, indefinitely. In many ways, Fulgrim's punishment is built directly into his reward. He became exactly what he wanted and discovered that it wasn't enough. 10,000 years later, that remains true, of course. The modern Fulgrim is fascinating because he exists as both conqueror and prisoner, a being of immense power trapped within his own nature, a Primarch capable of reshaping worlds, yet incapable of satisfying himself. Every victory becomes meaningless, every pleasure familiar, every sensation losing its potency. And so the search continues, endlessly. It's almost tragic in a mythological sense, like Tantalus reaching for water that retreats every time he touches it, or Sisyphus pushing the stone uphill forever. Fulgrim's curse is not failure, it's endless dissatisfaction. The recent lore has only reinforced this interpretation. As Fulgrim becomes increasingly active once again, we see a character who's remained obsessed with experience, transformation, and self-expression. The Emperor's children are returning to prominence. Fulgrim himself is once again becoming a major figure within the wider narrative. And what strikes me most is how confident he appears. Not angry like Angron, not bitter like Mortarion, not conflicted, pulled apart like Magnus. He is confident, almost serene in his arrogance, as though he genuinely believes his choices were correct. And perhaps that's what makes him so dangerous. Because unlike some of the other traitor Primarchs, Fulgrim rarely appears burdened by regret, at least not openly. He embraces what he's become, or perhaps he has simply convinced himself that he does. There is a subtle difference, of course, and I expect that difference may become increasingly important in future stories. Which brings us to the fundamental question. Who is Fulgrim? Is he a monster? Certainly. Is he a villain? Without question. Is he responsible for unimaginable suffering? Absolutely. Yet none of these descriptions really tell the full story, because before he was any of those things, Fulgrim was a dreamer, a creator, a man who genuinely wanted humanity to be extraordinary. And that part of him never truly disappeared. It simply became twisted beyond recognition. That's what makes his story so powerful to me. The same qualities that once made him heroic eventually made him monstrous. His ambition became vanity, his discipline became obsession, his appreciation for beauty became an addiction. His pursuit of excellence became excess. It was never enough. The transformation feels inevitable in hindsight, yet when you look at who Fulgrim originally was, you can still see the path not taken, the better version of himself, the Primarch he could have become. And perhaps that's why Fulgrim remains such a compelling character, at least for me. Because unlike some villains, he's not defined by what he gained, he's defined by what he lost. The ruler who saved Chemos, the friend of Ferrus Manus, the champion of human potential. The Primarch who believed greatness was possible. Those things died long before demonhood ever took him. Long before the scales and wings, long before Slaanesh. And somewhere beneath the arrogance, beneath the corruption, beneath the 10,000 years now of excess, I suspect the ghost of that man is still existing in there somewhere. Not strong enough to escape, not strong enough to change, but present nonetheless. A reminder that the greatest tragedies in Warhammer are not the stories of people who were always monsters. They are the stories of people who once had the potential to become something magnificent. If there is one Primarch who has been misunderstood more than any other, it is Perturabo. And the strange thing is that a large part of that misunderstanding comes from Perturabo himself. Because nobody spent more time convincing the galaxy that Perturabo was a bitter, joyless siege engineer than Perturabo did. Nobody spread that image more effectively. Nobody believed it more completely. Nobody suffered because of it more profoundly. For years, if you asked people about Perturabo, the answers were usually quite predictable. The angry one, resentful one, siege specialist. The Primarch with the permanent grudge. The man whose hobbies consisted primarily of complaining about Rogel Dawn. And to be fair, some of that reputation is entirely deserved. Perturabo could hold a grudge with a level of dedication that would genuinely impress most Imperial archivists. But the deeper you dive into his character, the more fascinating he becomes. Because beneath all the bitterness lies one of the greatest tragedies in the entire Primarch project. a man who wanted to create but was forced to destroy, a genius who dreamed of building wonders, condemned to spend his life reducing other people's wonders to rubble. And eventually, after decades of frustration, he became exactly what the galaxy expected him to be, which is perhaps the saddest part of all. To understand Perturabo, you have to start with Olympia, because Olympia explains almost everything really. Unlike some Primarchs, Perturabo did not grow up battling monsters or conquering savage wastelands. Olympia was civilized, political, even sophisticated, a world of city-state rivalries and intrigue. And from an early age, Perturabo distinguished himself through one simple fact. He was brilliant. Not merely intelligent, but actually brilliant. There is a tendency among fans to describe every Primarch as a genius, which is fair enough because they essentially were, but even among the Primarchs, Perturabo's intellect stood out. Engineering and architecture, mathematics, logistics, military science even, he mastered all of it almost effortlessly. I've always found this fascinating, that when people think of Perturabo, they usually imagine fortresses, siege, artillery. Yet when you actually look at his character and the history, what he really loved was creation, design and construction, the art of making something beautiful. There are moments throughout the lore where Perturabo discusses architecture and engineering with genuine passion, not because they're useful, because he actually loves them. And this is an important distinction, because it immediately changes the imagery many people have of him. Perturabo was not born wanting to wage war. None of the Primarchs were, arguably. But Perturabo especially feels like somebody who might have thrived in a different universe. A universe where his talents were directed towards building cities, rather than destroying them. A universe where his greatest achievements would have been monuments rather than battlefields. Unfortunately for him, this is Warhammer, and Warhammer has a habit of taking people's dreams and feeding them into the industrial machinery. When the Emperor arrived, he immediately recognized Perturabo's capability, and for a time, things looked promising. As we know, Perturabo can take a look at almost anything and know how it works. Incredibly useful addition for the Emperor, if you ask me. The Iron Warriors became one of the most effective legions in the Great Crusade. Not the most celebrated or the most glamorous, glorious, but perhaps one of the most reliable alongside the Dark Angels and a few others. That's a distinction that becomes increasingly important, because while other legions earned glory through spectacular victory, the Iron Warriors were often assigned the tasks nobody else wanted. The impossible siege, the grinding campaign, the war of attrition. The ugly work, essentially. Unpleasant, but necessary. And Perturabo completed those tasks with ruthless efficiency again and again and again. And this is where the tragedy begins, because success can sometimes be its own punishment. The more reliable Perturabo became, the more difficult assignments he received. The more difficult assignments he completed, the less appreciation he received. Eventually the pattern emerges. If there was a nightmare campaign nobody else wanted, the Iron Warriors were the ones that would handle it. And if the Iron Warriors handled it, the galaxy would simply move on to the next war. No celebration or parade, no admiration, just another expectation. I've often thought this is the root of almost everything that eventually goes wrong, really. Not jealousy or pride, not even resentment per se, but neglect. Perturabo spent much of his life feeling overlooked. Now, before people start shouting that plenty of Primarchs had difficult lives, it's absolutely true. The difference is that Perturabo never learned how to cope with this. That's one of his great flaws, really. Many Primarchs experienced hardship, as we know, but Perturabo internalized it. Every slight, every disappointment, every perceived insult, every comparison, particularly the comparisons, because eventually there was one comparison he could never escape, which was Rogel Dawn. Poor Rogel Dawn, or perhaps poor Perturabo, depending on your perspective. Because the rivalry between these two is one of the most fascinating relationships in Warhammer. I've always found it remarkable that Dawn and Perturabo were actually quite similar. Far more similar than either would probably have liked to admit. Both valued duty, discipline, engineering, fortifications, building. Both possessed immense determination. The difference was emotional. Dawn accepted duty, but Perturabo resented his role. Dawn built walls because they needed building. Perturabo built walls while wondering why nobody appreciated his efforts. It's not a criticism per se, but it is an observation. And over time, that difference became enormous, of course. The more Perturabo compared himself to Dawn, the more miserable he became. Because in his mind, Dawn seemed to receive everything that he didn't. Recognition, admiration, even respect. Whether that perception was entirely fair is another matter, but perception often matters more than reality, particularly when resentment is involved. One thing that makes Perturabo such a compelling character for me is that his flaws are, as with all the Primarchs in many ways, painfully human. Many Primarchs feel mythological, but Perturabo often feels a very personal character. Most people understand what it's like to feel overlooked. Most people understand what it's like to watch somebody else receive recognition you believed that you earned. Most people understand bitterness, and that's what makes him relatable, and also what makes him so dangerous. Because bitterness rarely remains passive. Eventually, it demands some kind of expression. The breaking point comes during the Horus Heresy. But honestly, I think Perturabo's fall begins long before that. By the time Horus approaches him, years of frustration have already accumulated. Years of disappointment, resentment, the feeling of being unappreciated. Chaos didn't create any of these emotions, as is often the case. It simply exploits them. Much like Fulgrim's perfectionism or Mortarian's stubbornness, Perturabo's bitterness becomes the doorway. And once he steps through it, there's not really any going back. One of the darkest moments in his history is the destruction of Olympia. When rebellion erupts on his homeworld, Perturabo responds with an overwhelming brutality. The slaughter is catastrophic. And what's fascinating is that even he seems horrified by what he's done afterwards. People sometimes portray Perturabo as emotionless, but he isn't. He's actually quite the opposite. The problem is he feels everything too intensely. Anger, regret, disappointment in himself and others, humiliation. The massacre of Olympia haunts him precisely because he understands the significance of it. A creator destroying his own creation, a son destroying his own home. There is something very tragic about all of it, really. By the heresy itself, Perturabo has become one of Horus's most valuable commanders, and honestly, it's easy to understand why. Unlike many of the traitors, Perturabo remained very practical. He was professional and focused. While others became consumed by madness or chaos corruption, Perturabo often feels like the last adult left in the room, really. And I've always found this quite amusing in a way. The man with the legendary temper somehow ends up being one of the most rational figures among the traitor Primarchs. And he doesn't lose himself too much to chaos, and it's only recently that he's actually become a demon Primarch. He took a long time to fall into this compared to other traitors. The Siege of Terra perhaps is the ultimate example. Again and again, Perturabo proves indispensable to the traitor effort. Again and again, his expertise carries the entire war effort, really. But his contributions are overshadowed by larger personalities, yet again. It's almost a summary of his entire life, really. Even when he's winning, somebody else receives the attention. Eventually, he abandons Horus altogether, and honestly, this feels like a very Perturabo move. Unlike Lorgar, Fulgrim, or Angron, his loyalty to Chaos was never especially ideological. He wasn't searching for gods, transcendence, enlightenment, recognition he was looking for. He wasn't searching for gods or transcendence or enlightenment. He was just searching for recognition. Chaos simply happened to be the vehicle that he chose. Which of course brings us to the modern setting. This is where Perturabo becomes increasingly interesting. because for years he existed mostly in the background, like many of the Primarchs, mentioned, referenced, but rarely explored. Yet recently things have started changing. The Iron Warriors remain one of the most formidable forces within Chaos. Perturabo himself continues to loom over the setting with the new Cadian Gate campaign. He, of course, has been leaked in some images of himself being this massive mechanical monstrosity, the ultimate siege engine. Unlike some of the Demon Primarchs, he retains an unusual degree of practicality and personality that he once had. That's always been one of his defining characteristics for me. Mortarion obviously has lost himself to Nurgle. Magnus is broken into pieces. Angron is nothing like what he once was, maybe even the ultimate manifestation of it. But Perturabo is still pretty practical and fairly himself compared to many. Even now, I would say, particularly now, I've often wondered whether Perturabo is secretly one of the most dangerous Primarchs still active. Not because he's necessarily the strongest, because he's one of the few who never completely surrendered his ability to think strategically. Chaos champions are terrifying, as we know. Chaos champions with patience are perhaps even worse. And Perturabo has always been a patient man. Which brings us to the fundamental question. Who is Perturabo? Is he a villain? Certainly. A traitor without question. Responsible for immense suffering? Absolutely. But the descriptions only really scratch the surface. At his core, Perturabo is a character defined by disappointment, really. A gap between what he wanted to be and what he became. The architect who became the destroyer, the builder who became the siege master, the dreamer who became the cynic, the son who desperately wanted recognition and spent his life convincing himself he didn't need it. That's why I think he's one of the most tragic Primarchs, really, much like many of the traitors, to be honest. Not because he was misunderstood by others, but because he never truly understood himself. He spent his life proving his worth to people who were never going to satisfy him, chasing validation that could never fill the emptiness he carried. And in the end, all that brilliance, all that talent, all that potential became consumed by resentment. When people think of Perturabo, they often imagine fortress worlds, fortress walls, sieges, iron artillery, the machinery, the mechanics of war. But I think of something else, really. I think of a Primarch staring at a city that he could have built, a masterpiece he never got the chance to create, and wondering how his life ended up so far from the future he once imagined. Because beneath all that bitterness, the anger, beneath all the iron and all the wars, Perturabo may simply be the story of a man who wanted to build beautiful things and spent his entire life tearing them down instead. If Rogel Dawn is one of the most tragic Primarchs because of his burdens that he chose to carry, then Conrad Kurz is one of the most tragic because of the burdens he never escaped. And this distinction matters enormously, because Kurz is often reduced to a very simple description. The insane one, murderer, psychopath, the monster, the Primarch who skinned people alive and somehow made the rest of the traitor Primarchs feel slightly uncomfortable, which admittedly is quite an achievement. But while none of those descriptions are entirely wrong, they don't really explain Conrad Kurz, not really. They explain what he became, not who he was. And with Kurz, that difference is absolutely everything, really. Because unlike Angron, who was broken by his pain, or Fulgrim, who was destroyed by his obsession, Kurz's tragedy begins almost from the moment he arrives in the galaxy. There is a sense throughout his entire story that something has gone wrong from the very beginning, really. Not necessarily corruption, not necessarily evil, something deeper. As though fate itself has already decided where his life was heading and simply neglected to inform him. To understand Conrad Kurz, you have to begin with Nostromo, and honestly few Primarch home worlds explain their Primarch more completely than Nostromo explains Kurz. Nostromo was, frankly, awful. Not dangerous in the way Fenris was dangerous, not harsh in the way Inuit was harsh, not brutal in the way Barbarous was brutal, but it was just worse. corrupt, rotten, decaying, a world where crime was normalized, murder was commonplace, justice didn't even exist really. The powerful preyed upon the weak and nobody seemed particularly interested in stopping them. It was a society that had fundamentally given up on the idea of morality. And into that darkness came Konrad Kurz alone, completely alone. Unlike many of his brothers, Kurz had no adoptive family, no mentor, tribe, kingdom, father figure, no support, no guidance, nothing. The infant Primarch essentially raised himself in the shadows of one of the worst worlds in the Imperium. And this matters, of course, because when people discuss Kurz, they often jump straight to the violence, executions, terror campaigns, the insanity of him really. What they sometimes overlook is the loneliness. Kurz may have been the loneliest Primarch who ever lived. Imagine possessing the mind of a Primarch. Imagine understanding things nobody around you can understand. Imagine seeing horrors every day. And imagine doing all of that completely alone. That was Kurz's childhood. And then there are the visions, of course. The visions are perhaps the most important aspect of his character, really. Because Kurz possessed prophetic abilities unlike almost any of his brothers. He did see the future. Not perfectly, not always clearly, but often enough. And what he saw haunted him. I've always thought one of the most terrifying aspects of Kurz's existence is that he genuinely believed he knew how everything would end. Imagine living with that certainty. Imagine believing every tragedy was inevitable, every betrayal predetermined, every failure unavoidable. I think this would break most people. Kurz never had the opportunity to become most people, of course. His entire life was shaped by the belief that destiny could not be escaped. This idea sits at the center of everything about him, really. Because while many Primarchs struggle with fate, Kurz eventually surrenders to it. Not immediately, not willingly, but gradually and painfully, like a man drowning who eventually stops fighting the current. When Kurz begins his war against crime on Nostramo, there is something almost heroic about it. People do forget this, obviously. The future Night Haunter starts as the Vigilante. A terrifying one, admittedly, the sort of vigilante who would make Batman immediately begin reassessing his life choices, but still his intentions are understandable. He wants justice and order. He wants to protect the innocent. The problem comes with his methods, of course. Kurz reaches a conclusion that defines his entire existence. Fear works. And the terrible thing is that he's right. Fear does work, at least in the short term. Criminals stop committing crime when they know a supernatural monster might remove their spine and hang it from a building. Society becomes more orderly. Violence decreases, lawlessness retreats. The results are undeniable, but the means are not justified. There is a problem, obviously. Fear creates obedience, but it does not create virtue. People behave because they are terrified, not because they are better. And Kurz never fully understands the distinction here, I feel. Or perhaps he understands it and cannot imagine another solution, really. Either possibility is tragic for his character. I've often thought Kurz's greatest flaw wasn't his cruelty, it was his cynicism, the nihilism of him. He fundamentally lost faith in humanity, really. Not because he hated people, because he expected the worst from everyone, always. He looked at mankind and saw weakness, corruption, selfishness, failure. And because he expected those things, he found them in everyone. Eventually the Emperor arrives, and for a brief moment there is hope, or at least the possibility of it. Kurz discovers he has brothers, a purpose, a place within something larger than himself. Yet even here things begin going wrong almost immediately for him. Because Kurz never really fits in, as you can imagine. Many Primarchs struggled with belonging. Kurz struggles with existence itself. He looks at his brothers and sees things he can never have. Friendship, acceptance, normality. Even among demigods, Kurz feels isolated. And perhaps most tragically, some of that isolation is self-inflicted, because Kurz pushes people away before they can reject him. It's a remarkably human flaw, painfully human really. The Night Lords themselves become an extension of his worldview, as do all the legions to their Primarch. And this is where things become genuinely pretty fascinating really. Unlike many legions, the Night Lords are not built around hope or honour or idealism. They're built around inevitability. The certainty that fear is the only language people truly understand. The certainty that darkness is humanity's natural state. The certainty that morality ultimately fails. Those beliefs all originate with Kurz, and they reveal a great deal about him. Because deep down, Kurz never really believed people could become better. It's a devastating thing for a leader to believe. And then comes the heresy. And honestly, by this point, Kurz is already falling apart. I've always found it interesting that Kurz doesn't really betray the Imperium in the same way many of the other traitors do really. Horus chose his rebellion, Fulcrum chose corruption. In the end, Mortarion chose that resentment. Kurz almost feels as though he simply arrives at the conclusion he always expected really. Of course everything collapses. Of course brother betrays brother. Of course civilization fails. The galaxy is merely proving his nihilism correct. Again and again and again. One of the most fascinating relationships in his life is with Sanguinius. Because Sanguinius represents everything Kurz wishes he could be really. Both possess visions, they see terrible futures, they understand suffering. Yet Sanguinius remains hopeful. Kurz cannot. The contrast is extraordinary. Two brothers burdened with the same gifts, the same knowledge, reaching completely different conclusions. One chooses hope and the other chooses despair. And perhaps that's why Kurz becomes so obsessed with him. Because every time he looks at Sanguinius, he sees evidence that another path might have been possible. A path he could never bring himself to walk. As the heresy progresses, Kurz descends further and further into madness. But even here, I think sometimes people misunderstand him. Kurz is not simply just insane. He's fractured. And there is a difference here. He remains intelligent, perceptive, often disturbingly insightful. Some of his observations about the Imperium are entirely correct. The tragedy is that he uses those insights to justify increasingly horrific actions. And then comes the ending. And what an ending it is. Perhaps the most fitting death any Primarch has ever received. Kurz does not fight, he does not flee, he does not resist. Instead, he allows the assassin M. Shen to kill him. And before his death, he delivers one of the most famous lines in all of Warhammer. Death is nothing compared to vindication. It's an extraordinary moment really, because even at the very end, Kurz believes he has been proven right. The Imperium sent an assassin, the cycle of violence continued. Humanity remained exactly what he has always believed it to be. In his mind, the universe has validated his worldview. The terrible possibility is that part of him was correct. Which brings us to the fundamental question, of course. Who was Konrad Kurz? Was he a monster? Certainly. His crimes are beyond counting. Was he a murderer? Without question, entire worlds suffered because of him and his legion. Was he insane? At times, undeniably. Yet none of those descriptions fully explain him really. At his core, Kurz is something much sadder really. A man who lost faith. A man who looked into the future and saw only darkness. A man who became so convinced of humanity's flaws that he stopped believing redemption was possible. And once somebody reaches that point, the route back becomes incredibly difficult. The galaxy remembers the Night Haunter, the skinning pits, the terror campaigns, the nightmare stories. What it often forgets is the lonely child on Nostromo, the boy who grew up without guidance, the Primarch who never truly believed he could escape his own destiny, the son who desperately wanted the universe to make sense and became increasingly horrified when it didn't. And perhaps that's why Konrad Curze remains such a compelling character, because unlike many villains, he never really sees himself as one. He sees himself as evidence that humanity is broken, evidence that justice is impossible, evidence that fate cannot be escaped. The tragedy is not that Curze became a monster. The tragedy is that somewhere along the way, he convinced himself he had never been anything else. And in doing so, he may have ensured that the future he feared most was the only future he could ever reach. Because sometimes the most dangerous prophecy is not the one that comes true. It's the one that you stop trying to prevent. Of all the Primarchs, the 11th may be the most haunting. Not because of anything that we know, but because of everything that we don't. It sounds like a contradiction, but in many ways the 11th Primarch is less a character and more a shadow really. A shape in the darkness, a missing page torn from the history book. A name that once existed and now doesn't. The second Primarch is often discussed as a mystery. The 11th feels different. The second feels forgotten, the 11th is erased. And perhaps that's why people remain so fascinated by him. Because there is something deeply unsettling about an absence this large. 20 Primarchs were created, 18 remain. 2 missing. Yet somehow those missing brothers continue to dominate conversations 10,000 years later. That is remarkable when you think about it really. Entire novels have been written about Guilliman, entire series have explored Horus. Characters like Sanguinius Magnus the Lion possess decades of lore really. The 11th Primarch possesses almost nothing, and still people speculate and talk about them. They still wonder, still search for the answer. The mystery itself has become immortal, of course. To understand the significance of the 11th Primarch, you first have to understand what makes him different from the others. Most Primarchs are remembered for what they achieved, of course. The Lion, uniting Caliban, Russ becoming the Wolf King, Guilliman building Ultramar, Sanguinius dying upon the vengeful spirit. Even Horus, the greatest traitor in human history, is remembered. The 11th is not remembered. This distinction matters, of course. History remembers villains, history remembers heroes, history remembers failures. The 11th Primarch exists beyond all of these categories, because history itself was taken from him. This is an extraordinary fate, perhaps the most extraordinary fate any Primarch has suffered. I've always found it interesting that the Imperium remembers Horus, if you think about this for a moment. The man who nearly destroyed humanity, the architect of the greatest catastrophe in Imperial history, the individual responsible for the deaths of untold billions, and yet Horus remains part of the Imperial record. His statues are not torn down, his name became cursed, but he was remembered. But the 11th Primarch was not. Something about his fate was apparently considered even less acceptable than remembrance of a heretic themselves, and it raises the uncomfortable question. What could possibly justify this treatment? The answer, of course, is that we don't know, and we never really will. There are theories. There are always theories. Some suggest corruption, others mutation, others betrayal. There are theories involving Xenos influence, theories involving the Rangdan Xenocides, theories involving forbidden knowledge, and theories involving events so complicated they usually require several diagrams and a concerning amount of free time. But none of them are confirmed, of course. None of them solve the mystery. And honestly, I think this is intentional, of course, because the 11th Primarch was never designed to be solved. He was designed to be imagined, perhaps for your own miniatures. The more I've thought about the lost Primarchs over the years, the more convinced I've become that their purpose is thematic rather than narrative. They exist to remind us that history is incomplete, that even the Imperium doesn't know its own past, that there are wounds so deep they never truly heal, that the Imperial record may be falsified in many ways. As we know, history is written by the victor. The 11th Primarch is one of these wounds, a scar on the Imperial family, a reminder that the Emperor's grand project was never as flawless as Imperial propaganda likes to pretend. Because that's another thing people overlook. The existence of the lost Primarchs tells us something important about the Emperor, namely that even he could fail, or at least that there are some outcomes that existed which he considered completely unacceptable, even with his foresight. The Emperor created 20 sons, 2 disappeared from history entirely, and that fact alone changes how we view the Primarch project. The Emperor wasn't creating gods, he created individuals, and individuals, as we know, can go very wrong. What I find particularly fascinating about the 11th Primarch is the reaction of the surviving brothers. Whenever the lost Primarchs are referenced in the lore, there is often a strange sadness attached to them really, a sense of loss, of regret. The surviving Primarchs rarely speak of them with hatred really. This is an important distinction. Hatred is easy, straightforward, but regret is a more complicated emotion. Regret suggests something valuable was lost, something worth losing, worth mourning. I've often wondered whether this is the real tragedy really. Not that the 11th Primarch failed, not that he was removed from history, but that his brothers remember enough to miss him. Imagine being Guilliman, for example. Imagine knowing that your family once had another member or 2. Imagine knowing conversations took place that you can no longer really recall. Victories were fought alongside a brother whose face has vanished from memory. Friendships existed, arguments, shared experience, and now they're all gone. Not naturally, but deliberately removed. There is something profoundly disturbing about all of it. It's one thing to lose history, it's another thing to have history taken from you. The more you examine the lost Primarchs, the more they begin to resemble a form of collective trauma, if you will. An event so painful that everyone involved eventually agrees never to discuss it again. Not because it didn't happen, because it did, and it mattered, and it hurts. And perhaps nowhere is this more apparent than with the 11th. The 11th Primarch almost feels like a ghost, haunting the edges of the setting. Never seen directly, never heard clearly, but was present. There are moments throughout the heresy where characters acknowledge the existence of the lost Primarchs only for the conversation to stop abruptly. The silence itself, meaningful. The refusal to speak becomes part of the story really. It's remarkably effective storytelling when you think about it. Most fictional universes answer questions directly, but Warhammer occasionally refuses, and that refusal creates a mystery larger than almost any answer could. Let's be honest, if Games Workshop revealed the 11th Primarch tomorrow, a large part of the magic would disappear immediately. No explanation could truly ever compete with 40 years of speculation. No backstory could match the imagination of millions of fans. The mystery works precisely because it remains unresolved. The unknown is doing all the heavy lifting, as we can see. And nowhere is that more true than with the 11th. Because unlike the second, who sometimes feels associated with intellectual curiosity and some forgotten history, the 11th often feels associated with loss itself. A brother who should be standing among the others but isn't. A place at the table that remains permanently empty. A silence where a voice once existed. So this brings us to the question, who was the 11th Primarch? The answer is simple, we just don't know. We don't know his name, personality, we don't know his legion. We don't know achievements, failures, we don't know anything about his fate really. And I think this is the point, of course. The 11th Primarch ultimately represents something larger than any individual character. He represents uncertainty, the uncomfortable reality that some questions remain unanswered. The idea that history can be incomplete, that memory can fail, that the Imperium will rewrite anything that it needs to maintain its image. Even in a galaxy filled with gods, demons and immortal warriors, there are still mysteries nobody has solved. The galaxy remembers Horus, Sanguinius, Guilliman the Lion, heroes, villains alike, but somewhere in the darkness beyond recorded history stands the 11th Primarch, a forgotten son, a missing brother, a shadow cast across 10,000 years. And perhaps the strangest thing of all is that despite knowing almost nothing about him, despite possessing no name, face, voice, he remains one of the most fascinating figures in the entire setting. not because of who he was, but because of the hole that he left behind, what he could have been. And sometimes a shadow can tell us just as much as a thing that cast it. Of all the Primarchs, Angron is perhaps the easiest to pity. Not excuse or defend, not even justify, but you can feel sorry for him quite easily. This distinction is important, of course, because Angron is responsible for horrors beyond imagining, really. Entire worlds burned because of him. Millions died beneath his axe. His legion became one of the most terrifying forces in the galaxy. By any reasonable standard, Angron is a monster, probably the most monstrous of all the Primarchs in the end. Yet unlike many monsters, Angron did not choose the path that made him one, which makes his story, like many of the Primarchs, so tragic. Because when you examine the lives of the Traitor Primarchs, there is usually a moment where a different decision might have changed everything. Fulgrim could have rejected the Layer Blade. Magnus could have ignored the temptation to use forbidden power. Mortarion could have let go of his pride. Even Horus, despite everything, still possessed moments where another road remained open to him. With Angron, those moments are much harder to find, because before he even met the Emperor, before he even commanded the World Eaters, before he even heard the whispers of chaos, something had already been done to him, something that stole part of his future, and perhaps part of his soul. To understand Angron, as with all the Primarchs, you have to begin on his homeworld of New Kyria. And honestly, if there is one Primarch whose homeworld feels like a cruel joke played by fate, it's probably Angron. Because Angron was not supposed to become what he became, at least I don't think so. When the infant Primarch landed on New Kyria, he was discovered by slavers, not kings, warriors, tribes, but slavers. And from that moment onwards, his life became suffering. Now, suffering alone does not make Angron. Many Primarchs suffered. Curse, Mortarion, even the Lion endured isolation and hardship. The difference is that Angron was denied agency. Again and again, his life was defined by chains, literal chains and metaphorical chains. Every stage of his life involved somebody else making decisions for him. And this matters, I think, enormously for his character. Because if there is one thing that Angron values above all else, it's freedom. Ironically, perhaps more than even Jagged-Eye Khan. The difference is that the Khan experienced it, and Angron has never truly had this. The young Angron was forced into the gladiatorial arenas of New Kyria, and here we find the first glimpse of the man he might have become. A detail that often gets overlooked. Angron was compassionate. And I know this sounds strange, but this is true. Compassion is not exactly the first word people associate with the demon Primarch, whose primary hobby involves removing people from existence with chain axes. But it's true. Early Angron displayed remarkable empathy. He cared about his fellow gladiators. He protected them, fought for them, and even loved them. And I don't use this word lightly. There is a genuine affection in those stories, a genuine connection. The slave armies that eventually followed him did not merely obey him, they actually believed in him. It's a distinction that is crucial for his character later on, because Angron became something more than a gladiator, really. He became a symbol, a leader, a liberator, much like other Primarchs in many ways, a man who inspired hope among people who possessed almost none. I've always found that version of Angron very fascinating, really, because it reveals what the Emperor may have intended him to be. Not a destroyer, but a protector. The Primarch who understood suffering because he had experienced it himself. The son who fought for the oppressed because he had once been one of them. There is a beautiful story hidden inside Angron's origins. The tragedy is that it never gets the chance to flourish, really. And then comes the butcher's nails. And honestly, it is difficult to overstate how important they are, really. People often discuss Angron's anger as though it was simply part of his personality, but it wasn't entirely. The nails fundamentally altered him. They rewired his mind. They transformed pain into relief and peace into agony. Imagine that for a moment. Imagine a device that punishes every calm thought, every moment of happiness, every instant of contentment. Imagine being rewarded only when angry, only when violent, only when fighting and killing. How long would it take before rage becomes your natural state? Months, years? Angron endured it for centuries. And this reality changes everything really. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of his story is that he remains aware of what has been taken from him. The nails don't make him stupid. They don't erase his intelligence. If anything, they make his suffering worse because he understands it. He knows what's happened to him. He knows what he's lost and he cannot escape it. And then comes that defining moment. The moment that shapes the rest of his existence really. The Emperor arrives. And it should be a triumph. This is how Primarch stories are supposed to work. The father finds the son, the lost heir joins the Imperium, the great journey begins. Except that is not what happens. Because Angron is not waiting to be rescued, he's waiting to die, alongside his fellow gladiators, alongside the people that he loves, alongside the only family he has ever known. And then the Emperor takes him away. Just him. Not anyone else. I've always believed this is one of the most important moments in all of Warhammer, especially for Angron, because it destroys something inside of him. The Emperor saves his life while simultaneously taking away the only thing that gave his life meaning. The rebellion is crushed, the gladiators die, the family Angron chose is annihilated. And Angron never forgives him. Honestly, I'm not sure he ever could. It's a devastating thing to happen. The relationship never recovers. It never even begins, really. Unlike Horus, who loved the Emperor before turning against him, Angron's resentment begins almost immediately. The foundations were rotten from the start. And then we arrive at the World Eaters. And the tragedy here deepens, of course. Angron's relationship with his legion is extraordinarily complicated. He doesn't hate them, but he struggles to love them. Not because they are unworthy, because he never wanted them, and that is the uncomfortable truth here. Many Primarchs viewed their legions as sons. Angron often viewed his as a reminder of a life he didn't choose, a role he didn't want, an Imperium that he never believed in. And yet, despite all of this, moments of genuine connection still emerge, which makes everything even more sad, really. Because beneath the rage, there is still a fragment of the man he might have been. The problem is that those fragments become increasingly difficult to reach. The World Eaters eventually adopt the Butcher's Nails themselves, of course, and honestly, this may be one of the most tragic decisions in any legion's history, really, because it spreads Angron's suffering to thousands of others, an entire legion choosing to share its father's pain. Not understanding that pain was precisely the thing destroying him. There is something quite heartbreaking really about all of this. A desire for connection with the father becoming an act of self-destruction. And then we come to the heresy, and unlike some traitor Primarchs, Angron barely requires convincing, really. The Imperium has already failed him, the Emperor betrayed him, the galaxy failed him as well. Chaos simply offers direction to emotions that have been brewing for hundreds of years. Yet even here, I think people sometimes misunderstand Angron. His story is not really about hatred. Hatred implies a focus, a purpose. Angron's story is really about pain. Endless and relentless. Pain so overwhelming that eventually destruction becomes the only escape. I've often thought Angron may be the Primarch most defined by suffering, really. Not because he suffers more than anyone else, because suffering becomes his entire reality, his entire character, really. His identity, his whole existence. And then he comes to demonhood. And here the tragedy reaches the final form. Most demon Primarchs gain something. Power, knowledge, immortality, transcendence. Angron gains another set of chains. Different ones, but chains nonetheless. The great irony here is almost cruel, really, to his character. The Primarch who spent his life longing for freedom ultimately becomes the eternal servant of Khorne, bound forever, unable to escape, heal, or rest. The thing he wanted most remains forever beyond his reach. And honestly, it's one of the bleakest outcomes in the entire setting, really. Even now, 10,000 years later, Angron continues raging across the galaxy. Worlds burn, armies die, the Red Angel descends from the heavens and entire systems tremble. Yet beneath all of that violence remains the same tragedy, the same wounded gladiator, the same broken son, the same man who once fought for freedom on the sands of Nukeria. Which brings us to the fundamental question. Who was Angron? Was he a warrior? Undoubtedly. One of the best, really. Was he a destroyer? Without question, his legacy speaks for itself. Was he a monster? By the end, certainly. Yet none of this, as usual, really captures his character. At his core, Angron is something much sadder, really. Ultimately, he's just a victim. Not in a way that absolves him, not in a way that excuses what he became, but I would say in a way that explains him. He is the story of potential stolen before it could flourish, a hero who never received the chance to become heroic, a liberator who spent his life in chains, a compassionate soul buried beneath unimaginable pain. The galaxy remembers the rage, bloodshed, axes and screams. What people sometimes forget is the gladiator, the brother, the rebel, the man who inspired hope among the hopeless, the man who loved his brothers before he was snatched away from them. And perhaps that's why Angron remains such a compelling character for me. Among all the Primarchs, he may be the one who most clearly shows the difference between destiny and tragedy. Destiny suggests an inevitability of outcome. Tragedy suggests a loss. Angron was not destined to become the Red Angel. Something was taken from him, something precious and irreplaceable, and the galaxy has been paying the price ever since. Because every time Angron charges into battle, every time another world burns in his wake, every time Khorne's laughter echoes through the warp, there remains a lingering question, not what Angron became, but who he might have been if somebody had simply broken his chains instead of forging new ones. Of all the traitor Primarchs, Mortarion may be the hardest to judge fairly. Not because his actions are complicated, many of them aren't. Not because his motivations are impossible to understand, in truth they are painfully obvious. And most certainly not because he lacks flaws. Mortarion possesses enough flaws to keep Warhammer authors employed for another 20 years. The difficulty comes from something else. Because the more you learn about Mortarion, the more you realise that he is simultaneously one of the most justified and one of the most self-destructive Primarchs of them all, really. He is a man whose deepest beliefs were often correct, a man who saw genuine problems that others ignored, a man who understood dangers that many of his brothers underestimated, and yet somehow, despite recognising so much truth, he consistently reached the wrong conclusion. There is something almost Shakespearean about all of it. A man intelligent enough to identify the disease, yet incapable of accepting the cure. And perhaps that's why Mortarion remains such a fascinating character, really. Because unlike Fulgrim, who falls through his obsession, or Angron, who falls through his suffering, Mortarion falls through his resentment. Slowly, patiently, almost methodically, much like the Death Guard, really. Until eventually, that resentment becomes the defining force in his life. To understand Mortarion, as with all the Primarchs, you must begin on his home world of Barbarous. And honestly, if there is a world more perfectly designed to create a bitter man, I would struggle to think of it, really. Barbarous was misery made physical, a toxic nightmare of poisonous mountains, endless suffering, and tyrannical overlords. Humanity existed there in a permanent state of oppression. The common people lived in the lowlands while monstrous rulers occupied the heights above them. Literally above them, looking down, controlling them and exploiting them. The symbolism is not subtle with this one, and into this world came Mortarion. From the very beginning, his life became defined by a single idea: hatred of tyrants. Not dislike or opposition, but a deep, consuming hatred. Because Mortarion experiences their tyranny firsthand. It's no abstract concept to him. It's his reality. His daily existence is suffering at their hands. And that experience, as with all the Primarchs, shapes everything that follows, really. One of the most important relationships in Mortarion's life is with Nakar, the Overlord who raises him. Now, raises is perhaps a generous description. Nakar essentially uses him, controls him, manipulates him. Mortarion grows up surrounded by cruelty masquerading as authority, power exercised without any compassion, strength imposed with no justice. And over time he comes to associate hierarchy itself with oppression. And this distinction matters a lot for later on, because many people resist tyrants. Mortarion learns to distrust power entirely. The problem is that this belief never really leaves him, even after Barbarous, even after the Emperor, even after the Great Crusade. The wound remains open, the resentment remains alive. Eventually Mortarion descends from the poisonous mountains and joins humanity. And here we see one of the most admirable aspects of his character. Because unlike some Primarchs, Mortarion genuinely identifies with ordinary people. Not theoretically, but actually on a personal level. He remembers suffering, weakness, fear. There is a grounded quality to Mortarion that many of the Primarchs lack. He does not see himself as separate from humanity, at least not initially. He sees himself as one of them, simply a stronger version. That perspective influences everything that he becomes, really. It's one reason the Death Guard becomes so respected during the Great Crusade, because they embody endurance. Not glory and spectacle, but this endurance of character. They march through conditions that would break other legions. They survive hardship that would destroy an ordinary army, and they do so without complaint, or at least much complaint. Mortarion values resilience above almost everything else. The ability to endure suffering, the ability to continue despite hardships, just the ability to survive, really. It sounds admirable, and often it is. The problem is that resilience can eventually become stubbornness, and stubbornness can eventually become blindness. Mortarion spends much of his life walking this line. And then comes the Emperor. And honestly, this is where things start going wrong very quickly, because the Emperor arrives at precisely the worst possible moment. Mortarion is preparing to overthrow Nakar, to confront the tyrant himself, to earn freedom through his own effort. And then the Emperor intervenes, Nakar dies, and the rebellion succeeds, but not because of Mortarion, because of someone stronger, someone more powerful, someone arriving from above. Now, if you're watching this and thinking that sounds suspiciously similar to the tyrants Mortarion already hated, congratulations, you've identified the problem in essence. I've always believed this moment is the single most important event in Mortarion's life, really, because from Mortarion's perspective, the Emperor doesn't save him at all. He humiliates him. He takes away his long-earned victory. The struggle of everything he's done has become meaningless. The lesson becomes unavoidable. Once again, power descends from above and decides everything for him. Once again, somebody stronger dictates his outcome. And once again, Mortarion has no choice in the matter. The resentment never truly fades, it simply waits. And then we move to the Great Crusade, and for a while things do function. Mortarion fights and conquers. He serves. Yet beneath the surface, dissatisfaction is growing. Mortarion notices things. He notices the Emperor's secrecy. He notices the concentration of power. He notices the hypocrisy of his actions. And to be fair, some of his criticisms are not entirely unreasonable. The Emperor demands obedience while concealing enormous truth. He speaks of liberation while ruling an empire. He condemns superstition while encouraging devotion. These contradictions exist, and Mortarion sees them. The tragedy is that seeing problems does not automatically produce wisdom. One of the most fascinating aspects of Mortarion's character is that he often identifies genuine flaws in others while remaining completely blind to similar flaws within himself. He hates tyrants, but then he serves Horus. He despises corruption, and then he embraces chaos. He values independence, and then he becomes the servant of a chaos god. The irony is obviously extraordinary, and entirely tragic, really. Unlike some of the traitors, Mortarian's fall feels almost inevitable in hindsight, really. Not because chaos controls him, because bitterness does. The resentment accumulated over decades finally finds a direction. Horus offers validation of his feelings, offers answers, offers somebody to blame, and Mortarian embraces it. I've always thought there is something deeply human in all of this, really. People often prefer explanations that confirm their existing frustrations, and Mortarian really is no different. The heresy becomes an opportunity to act upon grievances he has carried since the beginning. Yet even then, there are moments where doubt remains, moments where another path still appears possible. And then comes his journey through the warp and everything changes. The Death Guard become trapped, the plague spreads, and suffering becomes unimaginable. One by one his sons begin to die, or worse. And here we encounter perhaps the defining moment of Mortarian's existence, the bargain with Nurgle. Now, there is endless debate surrounding this moment. Was it a choice, coercion? Was it inevitable? Personally, I've always felt those discussions miss the emotional core of the scene, really. Because what really matters is not whether Mortarian had alternatives. What matters is why he accepted the offer. He could not bear watching his sons suffer. And for all of his flaws, this was the core defining principle here. The man who spent his life enduring pain finally encounters pain that he cannot endure. Not his own, but his son's. And so he yields, and the irony is devastating. The Primarch who hated servitude becomes the servant. The Primarch who despised corruption becomes the corrupted. The Primarch who fought tyrants becomes bound to one. Not a political tyrant, but something far worse. A god. And unlike Barbarous, there is no rebellion waiting at the end. And then he becomes a demon Primarch. And honestly, few transformations in Warhammer feel so tragic, really. Because Mortarian achieved everything he never wanted. Power beyond imagination, immortality, freedom from mortal limitation. And in the process loses almost everything that he actually valued. Independence, his principles, the certainty are all gone. All that remains is that bitterness. 10,000 years later, the bitterness is still driving him. We see it repeatedly in the modern lore, particularly during his confrontations with Guilliman. And these encounters are fascinating because they reveal how much of the old Mortarian still exists. He's not simply a demon, not simply a monster. The resentment remains recognizably human. The grievances remain painfully familiar. Part of him is still standing on Barbarous, still staring up at those mountains, still hating those who rule from above. And then came one of the most remarkable moments in recent Warhammer history when the Emperor speaks to Mortarian, not through visions or prophecy, but directly in the warp. And what makes this encounter so fascinating is not the power involved, it's the implications. Because the Emperor does not speak as though Mortarian is beyond redemption, it's actually quite the opposite. There is a sense through the exchange that the door remains open, a possibility remains, a future could remain for him. I've always found this really interesting, because if there's one traitor Primarch who feels genuinely conflicted beneath everything else, it might be Mortarian. Not because he regrets every decision, because some parts of him still remember who he used to be, and that memory hurts. Which brings us to the fundamental question. Who is Mortarian? Warrior, without question, one of the finest. Resilient, perhaps more than anyone. Was he a victim? In certain ways, I would say absolutely. But as usual, these descriptions never fully explain the character. At his core, Mortarian is a man consumed by resentment. A man who allowed old wounds to define his future. a man who spent so much time fighting oppression that he failed to recognize when he became oppressed by himself. The galaxy remembers the plague clouds, the scythe, demon wings, the horrors. What people sometimes overlook is the rebel, the liberator, the son who genuinely wanted humanity to stand on its own feet, the brother who saw flaws that others simply ignored, the Primarch who spent his life searching for freedom and repeatedly found new forms of captivity instead. And perhaps that is why Mortarion remains such a compelling character for me, because unlike many villains, his tragedy isn't hidden, it's clear to see. Every decision leads naturally into the next, every grievance feeds the next resentment, every wound remains untreated, until eventually the man disappears beneath the scars. The cruelest irony of Mortarion's story is that he spent his entire life trying to escape tyrants, only to discover that the most powerful tyrant he would ever serve was the bitterness that he carried within himself. And 10,000 years later, that prison remains firmly locked. Though perhaps, just perhaps, the Emperor's words suggest it may not stay that way forever. Of all the Primarchs, Magnus the Red may be the most frustrating for me. Not because he's badly written, it's quite the opposite. Not because his story lacks any depth, it most certainly does have depth. And certainly not because he isn't interesting. Magnus is one of the most fascinating characters in the entire setting. The frustration for me comes from something else, because Magnus is the Primarch who is right about so many things, and wrong about the ones that mattered the most. He is a character built almost entirely around contradictions, brilliant yet naive, wise and yet reckless, compassionate and yet arrogant, a seeker of truth who spends much of his life lying to himself. And perhaps that is why debates surrounding Magnus have never really ended. Even now, decades after his story was first told, fans still argue about him. Was he right or wrong? Did he do something wrong or everything wrong or nothing? The argument rages on, which, if we're being honest, is probably exactly how Magnus would have wanted it. Because if there's one thing Magnus loved, it was a good intellectual debate, preferably one lasting several centuries and involving increasingly dangerous levels of forbidden knowledge. To understand Magnus, like any of the Primarchs, you have to begin on his homeworld of Prospero. And unlike many Primarch homeworlds, Prospero was genuinely remarkable. Not because it was powerful or wealthy, because it was a world of scholars, curious people, mystics, researchers, philosophers, a civilization built around learning, a world where knowledge itself was valued. For Magnus, it was almost the perfect environment, really, because from the very beginning, Magnus possessed an insatiable desire to understand. Not conquer or rule, dominate. He simply wanted to understand. Many Primarchs seek control, but Magnus was seeking answers. The galaxy presented him with a mystery, and his immediate reaction is not caution, it's fascination. And honestly, who among us hasn't had this impulse? The difference is that most of us don't respond to curiosity by accidentally reshaping reality. Magnus occasionally did this. One of the things I've always loved about Magnus is that he genuinely believes knowledge should be shared. And this may sound like an obvious distinction, but many Primarchs didn't think this. It's surprisingly unusual. Many of his brothers hoard information, they protect their secrets, they limit their access. But Magnus wanted understanding to spread. He wanted humanity to grow, to evolve, to reach its full potential. At his best, there is something genuinely noble about his vision, as with many of the Primarchs, of course. Because Magnus is not pursuing knowledge for his personal gain, not primarily. He believes knowledge can improve humanity. He believes ignorance is the true enemy. And honestly, there are moments where he's probably correct. The tragedy is that noble intentions do not provide immunity from consequence. If anything, they sometimes make those consequences harder to recognize. Then there is the matter of his psychic ability, which is a big part of his character. Every Primarch is extraordinary, as we know, but Magnus exists in a category of his own, really. The sheer scale of his psychic power is difficult to overstate. From a very young age, he experiences reality differently from everyone around him. The warp is not some distant abstraction, it's part of his daily existence, a landscape he can perceive, explore, navigate, and perhaps most dangerously grow comfortable within. I've often thought this is where the roots of Magnus's downfall truly began, not with arrogance or chaos, but with comfort, complacency. Familiarity breeds confidence, and confidence becomes certainty. Certainty can eventually become hubris. Magnus spends so much time walking through the warp that he gradually begins to believe he understands it. And this is a dangerous assumption. Arguably the most dangerous assumption anyone in Warhammer has ever made. Because the warp rewards confidence right up until the moment it destroys you. And then we come to the 1,000 Suns, and honestly, few legions reflected their Primarch more completely. The 1,000 Suns are seekers, researchers, students. Everywhere they go, they gather knowledge, analyze information, pursue understanding. There is something genuinely admirable about them, particularly when compared to the endless brutality surrounding them usually. The 1,000 Suns are not trying to destroy civilizations, they're trying to elevate it. This aspiration gives them a unique quality among the legions really, a sense of purpose beyond the Great Crusade, the warfare, the compliance missions. Of course, there is also another significant problem, which is the flesh change. And here we encounter the first great tragedy of Magnus's life. His legion is dying, mutating, and falling apart. The very genetic legacy they inherited is destroying them. So imagine being Magnus, imagine possessing almost limitless knowledge, almost limitless power really, and then watching your sons suffer, watching them deteriorate, watching them disappear, and having nothing that you can do. Would you look for the solution? I think anyone would, of course you would. The problem is where Magnus finds his solution, or rather who provides it. Because this is one of the greatest ironies of his story. Magnus believes he has outwitted the powers of the warp, believes he's secured a victory, believes he's solved an impossible problem. In reality, he's merely taken the first step into a trap so vast he cannot even see the edges. And this is important because Magnus is not corrupted through malice. He's corrupted through his own confidence, through his belief that he can control forces beyond comprehension really. Then we have to talk about the Council of Nicaea. Honestly, few events in Warhammer generate more debate really. The Emperor places restrictions upon the use of psychic power. Magnus opposes it, Mortarion supports it, and the argument is complex, the politics are messy. Yet what really interests me most is Magnus's reaction, because deep down, Magnus genuinely believes that he is right. Not politically, but morally, intellectually. And that conviction prevents him from accepting the limit. I've always thought this as one of his defining flaws really. Magnus really struggles with this idea that wisdom sometimes means restraint. To him, a question exists to be answered. A mystery exists to be solved. A door exists to be opened. The possibility that some doors should remain closed never sits comfortably with him really. And then comes the moment. The moment and the warning. Horus has fallen, the Imperium is in danger, the galaxy on the brink of collapse. And Magnus knows. And this is where everything changes, because for perhaps the first time in his life, Magnus acts entirely from good intentions. No selfishness, no ambition, no hidden agenda. He simply wants to save his father, save the Imperium, save humanity. It's one of the purest motivations of any Primarch that I've ever seen possessed, really. And it leads directly to disaster, of course. The psychic message shatters the Emperor's great project. The webway breached, demons flood into reality, catastrophe unfolds. And suddenly Magnus discovers something awful. Being right about Horus does not mean being right about everything else. This is perhaps the central tragedy of his entire life, really. Magnus was right. Horus had betrayed the Imperium. The warning was necessary, the danger was real. Yet the methods were catastrophic, and that contradiction haunts his story forever. And then comes the burning of Prospero. I think it still remains one of the greatest tragedies in all of Warhammer, because nobody truly wins really. Not Magnus or Leman Russ, not the Imperium. Everyone loses. Entire civilizations burn, brother turns against brother, trust collapses completely. And beneath it all lies a terrible misunderstanding mixed with genuine mistakes. I've never particularly liked simplistic interpretations of this conflict, the idea that one side was entirely right and the other entirely wrong. The reality is much closer to real life and much sadder. Magnus made mistakes, enormous mistakes, but so did Russ, so did the Imperium, and millions died because of it. It's tragedy. It's not villainy, it's simply tragic. As Magnus falls further into chaos, one of the most fascinating things is how much of him remains unchanged really. The desire for knowledge persists, curiosity, the intellectual hunger. Even as a demon Primarch, Magnus remains recognisably Magnus really, which is both admirable and terrifying. Unlike some traitors, Magnus never completely abandons his ideals. He simply allows those ideals to consume him. And then he becomes a demon, and we encounter another irony. The Primarch who sought understanding gains more knowledge than ever before. The problem is that knowledge brings no peace, no satisfaction or resolution. There's always another mystery, another secret, another truth hidden behind another veil. The pursuit never ends. Perhaps it was never meant to. In modern 40k, Magnus remains one of the most active and dangerous Primarchs, a sorcerer king, a demon prince, a living embodiment of ambition and intellect, in the image of Tzeentch, of course. Yet beneath all of that power remains the same tragic figure, the scholar who simply wanted the answers, the son who simply wanted to help, the father who just wanted to save his legion, the dreamer who believed knowledge could fix everything. And perhaps that's why his confrontations with Guilliman are so fascinating, because they reveal how two brilliant minds can view the same galaxy differently. One seeks order, the other seeks deeper understanding. One builds systems, the other pursues truth. Neither is entirely wrong, but neither is entirely right. Which brings us to the question, who is Magnus the Red? Was he a scholar? Undoubtedly. The greatest the Imperium has ever known, most likely. Was he a sorcerer? Without question, only the Emperor could rival him, really. Was he arrogant? Absolutely, painfully so at times. But as usual, these descriptions barely scratch the surface really of the nuances of him. At his core, Magnus is a man who loved knowledge more than limitation, a man who believed understanding could solve every problem. A man who spent his life searching for truth and repeatedly discovered that truth carries a price. The galaxy remembers the crimson armor, the single eye of the Cyclops. What people forget, I think, is the teacher, the student, the idealist, the son who genuinely wanted to save humanity from ignorance. And perhaps that is why Magnus remains such a compelling character, because unlike many villains, his downfall emerges from one of humanity's greatest virtues: curiosity. The desire to know, the need to understand. Those instincts built civilization. They expanded horizons, transformed history, but they also led Magnus the Red into a ruin. The cruelest irony of his story is that he spent his entire life seeking enlightenment, and the moment he learned the future, and the more he learned, the further he drifted from the very future he hoped to create. Because sometimes knowledge is power, sometimes knowledge is freedom, and sometimes knowledge is simply another road to tragedy. Magnus never stopped searching for answers. The question is whether he ever truly found them. Of all the Primarchs, Horus Lupercal is the one that should have won. Not the heresy, not the final battle aboard the Vengeful Spirit. I mean something much simpler than that. His life. Because when you look at the Emperor's sons, Horus begins the story with almost every advantage imaginable. He's the first found, the first reunited with the Emperor, the son who spent decades fighting at his father's side, while most of his brothers are still scattered across the galaxy. He learns directly from the Emperor longer than any other Primarch, and as the Great Crusade expands across the stars, Horus increasingly becomes the standard by which the others are measured. Even those who disliked him are often respected by him. Even those who competed with him are often admitting his brilliance. Many of his brothers viewed his appointment as War Master as the obvious choice, because Horus had long been considered the Emperor's brightest and most favoured son. That's what makes his story so devastating, because Horus does not begin as a villain, he begins as the hero, the golden son, the heir apparent, the man everyone assumes will lead humanity into the future. And perhaps that is why his fall continues to resonate more than any other tragedy in Warhammer, because Horus was not supposed to become Horus, he was supposed to become the Emperor's greatest success. To understand Horus, like all the Primarchs, you must begin on his homeworld of Chthoniya. Now, Chthoniya often gets overshadowed by more dramatic Primarch homeworlds. It doesn't have the mythical forests of Caliban or the toxic mountains of Barbarous. It isn't filled with giant wolves or ancient dragons. It's a mining world, a rough and brutal place full of gangs, violence and survival. Yet it produces something remarkably important: adaptability. Chthonians were practical people. They understood how to navigate complex social structures. They understood loyalty, ambition, and power. Horus grows up learning how people really work. And this is a key to his character, of course. Because Horus is not the strongest Primarch. He may not be the smartest, he isn't the best craftsman. He isn't the greatest psychic talent. But what Horus possesses is something arguably more valuable. He understands people, better than almost any of his brothers really. While Perturabo studies fortifications, Horus studies personalities. While Magnus studies ancient secrets, Horus is studying motivations. While Russ wins loyalty through strength and Sanguinius through inspiration, Horus wins loyalty through connection. People like Horus. And it sounds too simple, but it is very important. The Primarchs are full of extraordinary individuals. Horus is the one who can bring them together. Sources throughout the heresy repeatedly describe him as a natural leader whose greatest strength was his ability to unite very different personalities and forge them into a coherent whole unit. That's why he becomes War Master ultimately. Not because he's the best at everything or anything, because he is good at everyone, and that's a difference. I've always found it interesting that when fans discuss Horus, they often focus on his military achievements, and to be fair, they are extraordinary. The Lunar Wolves possessed one of the finest records of the entire Great Crusade. Horus himself became legendary as a commander and diplomat, respected by his brothers and feared by enemies. Yet I don't think military genius is what elevated him above the others. It was his emotional intelligence. A strange phrase to use for a genetically engineered warlord, I know, but it is true. Horus understood what people wanted to hear. He understood how to inspire confidence. He understood how to make others feel valued. And that made him dangerous in a way many of his brothers never were. Because when Horus speaks, people listen. Not because they have to, but because they want to. And then comes Ulanor, the great triumph, the moment that everything changed. The Emperor names Horus War Master, the highest military office in the Imperium, Supreme Commander of the Great Crusade, first among equals, the son chosen above all others. And on paper, it's a victory for Horus, the culmination of everything Horus has achieved. The problem is that promotions are funny things. Sometimes the reward becomes the burden. Because from that moment onward, Horus stops being merely a Primarch and becomes responsible for an empire, for his brothers, for the Crusade, for expectations nobody could realistically fulfill. And then the Emperor leaves. This part often gets overlooked. The Emperor doesn't simply appoint Horus, he basically appoints him and disappears straight away. Not permanently, of course, but effectively. Returning to Terra to work on projects he refuses to explain, leaving Horus to manage the largest military campaign in human history with increasingly limited guidance. I've always thought this is where the real tragedy begins. It's not Davin and Chaos and Erebus. It's the Emperor leaving Horus. Because Horus spends much of his life seeking his father's approval. And suddenly the father whose approval matters is gone. Not dead or defeated, but just the absent father. There is something surprisingly human about all of this. Most people can understand disappointment. Most people can understand feeling abandoned. Most people can understand wondering whether expectations are becoming impossible to meet. The difference is that Horus experiences those feelings while commanding millions and millions of soldiers carrying the future of humanity on his shoulders. Not exactly the ideal conditions for emotional stability. And then we have to talk about the corruption. And here we encounter one of the most misunderstood aspects of Horus's story, in my opinion. People sometimes talk about Davin as though chaos simply flipped a switch, as though Horus walked into a magic temple one afternoon and emerged a completely different person, but it's not really what happens. Chaos simply, as it often does, exploits a weakness that already exists. The wound inflicted by the anathema and the manipulations of Erebus create the opportunity, but the seeds were already there. Horus had begun questioning the Emperor's decisions, resenting his secrecy, and wondering whether the Primarchs were ultimately being used rather than trusted. Chaos simply takes those concerns and magnifies them, and this matters enormously for Horus's character, because the best tragedies don't emerge from nowhere, they emerge from flaws that already exist. And Horus has flaws, as we know: pride, ambition, and ultimately an insecurity, a need for validation, the desire to remain special. There is a passage in the lore that has always stuck with me, describing Horus effectively believing he should remain the Emperor's favoured son no matter how many brothers were discovered. It's a small detail, but it tells you everything. For all his confidence, Horus fears losing his place. The War Master of the Imperium possesses the same insecurity found in countless ordinary people. He wants to matter. He wants to be loved. He wants to remain important. And Chaos understands this perfectly. The terrible irony is that Horus genuinely believes he is saving the Imperium, at least initially. That's what makes the heresy so compelling, of course. This is not a good versus evil story. Horus does not wake up one morning deciding to become evil. He convinces himself that rebellion is necessary, that the Emperor has failed, that drastic action is required. History is full of people who justified terrible decisions through noble intentions. Horus joins that very crowded list. And then we come to the heresy itself, and for a while, astonishingly, it almost pays off. Half the Imperium burns, brother fights brother, entire legions change sides, worlds die, dreams collapse, and the galaxy tears itself apart. And at the center of it all stands Horus, the bright and favored son. The son who should have inherited everything. There's a quote often associated with Horus that describes him as the brightest star, and that image feels appropriate to me, because stars don't simply shine, eventually they do collapse. And when they do, the destruction can be unimaginable. One of the saddest aspects of Horus's story is what happens to his relationships with his brothers. Consider Sanguinius, Dawn, Guilliman, even Loken. People who admired him, trusted him, loved him. Many of them continued mourning the loss of the old Horus long after he's gone. Because that's the thing about betrayal. It hurts most when it comes from somebody extraordinary, somebody close. Nobody expected better from Erebus, but everybody expected better from Horus. And then we arrive at the final battle and the end of everything. And by this point, the tragedy has reached its conclusion. The charismatic leader who once united humanity has become the instrument of its destruction. The beloved brother has become the hated enemy. The favoured son has become the ultimate disappointment. Even Abaddon would eventually conclude that Horus failed, viewing his father as weak for not finishing the war and ultimately abandoning the identity of the sons of Horus altogether. Think about how tragic this all really is. The man who once stood above every Primarch eventually loses even the loyalty of his own legacy. His legion abandons his name. His dream collapses, the rebellion fails, and his father kills him. The end. And yet somehow that still doesn't fully explain why Horus remains such a compelling character like many of the Primarchs. Who was Horus Lupercal really? Was he the conqueror? Absolutely one of the greatest. Was he a leader? Probably the greatest among all the Primarchs. Was he a traitor? Obviously. His actions define the very setting that we now see. But as usual, none of these descriptions really fully capture Horus Lupercal. At his core, Horus was a story of potential, the highest potential, the great promise, the brightest future, and the catastrophic consequence when that promise is broken. The galaxy remembers the rebellion, the betrayal, the siege, the duel. What people sometimes overlook is the man before all of that, the son who fought beside the Emperor, the brother admired by his entire family, the War Master trusted with humanity's future, the leader who genuinely seemed worthy of that trust. And perhaps that is why Horus remains one of the most tragic Primarchs of them all. Not because he fell, many Primarchs did. Not because he failed, many Primarchs also did. But because among all the Emperor's sons, Horus came closer than anyone to becoming exactly what he was supposed to be. He had everything. The trust, respect, the love, the future, and then he lost it. Not in a single moment, a single battle, but piece by piece, decision by decision, until eventually the brightest star in the Imperium became the darkness that consumed it. And 10,000 years later, the galaxy is still living in the shadow that he left behind. Of all the Primarchs, Lorgar Aurelian may be the most important. He's not the strongest, not the greatest, not the finest strategist, not the most beloved. In fact, if you were building the ideal Primarch from scratch, Lorgar would probably not be your first choice or your fifth, maybe even not your 10th. And yet despite all of that, there is a very serious argument that no Primarch helped shape the galaxy more profoundly than Lorgar. Not Horus, Guilliman the Lion, not the Emperor himself perhaps. Because whilst others fought wars, Lorgar changed ideas. And ideas, as we know, are much harder to kill. The Imperium of the 41st millennium is filled with things that would horrify the Emperor. Endless religious processions, cathedrals the size of continents, billions upon billions of worshippers, priests holding immense power, the god Emperor, worshipped across 1,000,000 worlds. And the truly remarkable thing is this: Lorgar predicted almost all of it. The greatest irony in 40k is not that Horus rebelled, it's not that Magnus fell, it's not even that the Emperor ended up worshipped as a god. The greatest irony is that the Imperium ultimately became Lorgar's Imperium. The galaxy spent 10,000 years proving him completely right. And that does not mean he was good, it does not mean he was justified, it certainly does not mean he was sane, but it does make him fascinating. To understand Lorgar, as with all the Primarchs, you have to begin on his homeworld of Colchis. And unlike many Primarch homeworlds, Colchis was not defined by warfare, it was defined by faith. Religion saturated every aspect of life. Prophecies, scripture, pilgrimage, and ritual. The divine was not something distant, it was everywhere. And from the moment Lorgar arrived, he was immersed in it. And this matters a massive amount. Because while many Primarchs learned how to fight before they learned how to think, Lorgar learned how to believe. He grew up asking questions about purpose, meaning, truth, the nature of existence itself. Even among his brothers, this made him an unusual character, perhaps uniquely unusual in his own way. Most Primarchs wanted to understand the galaxy, but Lorgar wanted to understand why the galaxy existed at all. This distinction, of course, shaped his entire life. There is a quote attributed to Lorgar that I think captures him perfectly. All I ever wanted was the truth. What's fascinating about that line is that I genuinely think he means it. People often portray Lorgar as some kind of manipulator, the schemer, the liar, and eventually he does become many of these things, of course. But at his core, Lorgar is a seeker. The problem is that seeking truth can become dangerous when you care more about finding answers than questioning them. And nobody demonstrates this better than Lorgar. When the Emperor arrives on Colchis, Lorgar immediately concludes that he has found what he's been looking for. A god, a divine being, the answer to every question, the culmination of every prophecy, the object of every prayer. There's just one problem, of course. The Emperor absolutely hates this idea, which is unfortunate for Lorgar, particularly when your entire identity revolves around believing it. The relationship between Lorgar and the Emperor is one of the most tragic in the setting because they just fundamentally misunderstand each other. Lorgar sees a god who refuses to acknowledge his divinity. The Emperor sees a son who refuses to listen. Both become increasingly frustrated. Neither truly understands the other, and eventually the disagreement becomes catastrophic. And then we come to the word bearers themselves. And honestly, I think they are one of the most misunderstood legions in the whole setting, to be honest. People often focus on what they become. The chaos cults, the dark rituals, the demonic summoning, the endless chanting that probably drives nearby legions completely mad. What gets forgotten is what they originally were. Missionaries, teachers, preachers. The word bearers didn't simply conquer worlds, they transformed them. Lorgar genuinely believed that military victory alone was not enough. A conquered world could rebel. A converted world would remain loyal. While other legions measured success in compliance rates, Lorgar measured success in belief. Ironically, from a long-term perspective, he may have been onto something here. And then we have to talk about Monarchia, one of the most defining points in his life, really. I don't think it's possible to overstate how important Monarchia is, not just for Lorgar, but for the entire setting. Because if there's a single moment that creates modern Warhammer 40,000, it's probably this one. Monarchia was Lorgar's masterpiece, the perfect city, a shining monument to humanity's devotion, a world transformed through faith, proof that his vision worked. And then the Emperor ordered it to be destroyed. Not damaged, but completely erased. The Ultramarines razed it to the ground. And then the Emperor forced Lorgar and the entire Wordbearers Legion to kneel before the ruins while explaining that everything they believed was completely wrong. He's not a god, their worship was a mistake, their life's work had failed. I've always thought this is a very cruel moment in Imperial history. Not because the Emperor was necessarily wrong, there was a legitimate reason behind his actions, as we know. The Imperial truth did matter. The danger of religion was real. The Emperor genuinely believed he was protecting humanity, but the methods were catastrophic. Public humiliation rarely changes minds, it usually hardens their resolve. And in Lorgar's case, it shattered something fundamental in his psyche. One source describes him falling into a deep melancholy after Monarchia, and honestly, it feels like an understatement to be sure. His entire worldview collapsed in a single afternoon. The god rejected him, faith failed him, the universe no longer made sense in his eyes. Most people would spend years recovering from this. Lorgar went looking for a new god instead, which in hindsight was probably not the healthiest response. So then we talk about the pilgrimage that comes after, and here we encounter the moment Lorgar truly changes history. Because unlike Horus, who falls to chaos later, Lorgar actively seeks it. Not power or domination, but truth. Again, always the truth. The tragedy is that this search eventually leads him to the primordial truth, the revelation that chaos and the warp are fundamental forces within reality. Guided by figures such as Engathel and influenced by Corferon and Erebus, Lorgar becomes convinced he has finally discovered the answers he always sought. And this is where Lorgar becomes dangerous, because conviction can be a powerful thing. Conviction combined with intelligence is more powerful still. Conviction combined with intelligence and absolute certainty can reshape the galaxy. Lorgar does not merely convert, he evangelizes. He spreads and he persuades. The first heretic becomes the first missionary of chaos, and eventually he reaches Horus. I've often thought that Horus may have started the heresy, but Lorgar created the conditions that made it possible. Without Lorgar, there is no organized corruption of Horus. Without Lorgar, there are no word-bearer schemes operating in the shadows for decades. Without Lorgar, the entire course of Imperial history may look very different. He is not the face of the heresy. He is the architect standing behind the face. And yet the greatest irony arrives after all of this. Because despite everything, despite the betrayal, despite the heresy, despite 10,000 years of bloodshed, Lorgar ultimately wins the argument. Theologically, of course. The Emperor does become a god. The Lectitio Divinitatis becomes the foundation of the imperial cult. The galaxy worships exactly as Lorgar always believed that it would. Imagine how infuriating this must all be for Guilliman, for example. 10,000 years of effort and the person proven right is Lorgar. Lorgar, the man who caused half the problem in the first place. There is a wonderfully grim piece of humour hidden in this reality. The Imperium spent 10 millennia fighting Lorgar while simultaneously becoming his greatest achievement. And then there is modern Lorgar, the demon Primarch prophet, a creature of immense power, and yet strangely absent for much of recent history. While other demon Primarchs rampage across the battlefield, Lorgar often feels like a figure waiting in the wings, really, which is precisely why so many fans suspect his return is inevitable. Because if the setting is entertaining an age of returning Primarchs, it feels almost impossible to imagine Lorgar remaining absent forever, particularly now when faith has become more important than ever. So who is Lorgar Aurelian really? Was he a traitor? Undoubtedly, perhaps the greatest of all, arguably because his predictions shaped the future. Was he a villain? Without question, entire worlds paid the price for his choices. Yet none of these descriptions really capture him fully, because at his core, Lorgar is a believer, the ultimate believer, a man who needed the universe to have meaning, a man who needed existence to possess a purpose, a man who could not escape a reality devoid of higher truth. The galaxy remembers the heresy, dark gods, corruption. What people sometimes overlook is the seeker, the son simply searching for answers, the Primarch who spent his entire life asking questions nobody else wanted to ask. And perhaps that is why Lorgar remains such a compelling character, really, because unlike many villains, he doesn't begin with hatred. He begins with faith, the desire to believe, the need to understand, the longing for something greater than oneself. Those are profoundly human instincts. The tragedy is that Lorgar followed them further than anyone else, and in doing so he transformed the galaxy forever. 10,000 years later, the Imperium still lives inside the consequences of his search for truth, whether it wants to admit it or not. Of all the Primarchs, Alpharius may be the most difficult to discuss, and that's before we even get to Amigon. Because unlike every other Primarch, the first challenge isn't understanding the character, it's figuring out whether you're even looking at the right character in the first place. For most Primarchs, the facts are reasonably straightforward. The Lion was raised on Caliban, Russ was raised on Fenris, Guilliman on Macragge. Simple enough. Then you arrive at Alpharius and suddenly every piece of information comes with an invisible asterisk attached to it. Maybe, possibly, according to one account, assuming anyone involved is telling the truth, which they probably aren't, which is a problem in general for the Imperium, I understand that. Even within the lore itself, contradictions surround Alpharius and Amigon so completely that certainty becomes almost impossible. And honestly, I think that's exactly how they want it. Because secrecy is not merely a tool for the Alpha Legion, it is their identity, really. It's their entire philosophy, a way of understanding reality itself. If Magnus believes knowledge is power, Alpharius believes controlling knowledge is power. The distinction changes everything about them. To understand Alpharius and Amigon, you first have to accept an uncomfortable truth. Much of what we know about them may be wrong. Some of it certainly is. That uncertainty isn't a flaw in the character, it is the character. The Alpha Legion exists in a permanent state of ambiguity. Truth is fluid, facts are weapons, certainty becomes a vulnerability. And from the Foundation emerges one of the most fascinating Primarch stories in all of Warhammer. Now, according to the most widely accepted version of events, Alpharius was the final Primarch officially discovered by the Emperor, at least officially. In the novel Alfarius, Head of the Hydra, it complicates matters significantly by suggesting that Alfarius may have actually been discovered first, operating in secret, long before the Imperium ever announced his existence. Whether that version is true remains deliberately unclear, of course, which is very Alpha Legion to do. Even their origin story arrives wrapped in misdirection. And then there is Amegon, the secret twin, the second Primarch, the hidden brother. One of the most remarkable revelations in Warhammer history, really. Because while every other Legion receives a single Primarch, the Alpha Legion receives two. Two minds, personalities, two perspectives operating behind a single public identity. I've always thought this detail explains almost everything about them, because Alfarius and Amegon grow up understanding something no other Primarch really experiences: a shared identity. Neither entirely the face, neither entirely the shadow. Together they become something unique, a Primarch who is also a partnership. And perhaps this is why they feel so different from their brothers. Most Primarchs are isolated figures. Alfarius and Amegon are never truly alone. And then we come to the Alpha Legion themselves, and honestly, no Legion embraced its Primarch's worldview more completely, perhaps. The Alpha Legion does not seek glory, it actively avoids it. The Alpha Legion does not seek recognition. Recognition is often a liability. The Alpha Legion does not care who receives credit for victory, only that the victory occurs. This makes them deeply unusual among the Legionnaires Astartes. Space Marines generally aren't known for their modesty. The Alpha Legion takes a different approach. Their greatest success is often a success nobody even knows happened. A rebellion prevented before it begins, a commander replaced before the battle starts, a war won months before the first shot was even fired. While other legions smash through walls, the Alpha Legion quietly convinces somebody to leave a door unlocked. It's less dramatic, but usually more effective, and occasionally very annoying for everyone involved, particularly historians trying to understand what happened. One of the defining characteristics of Alfarius is his patience, I would say. This is easy to overlook because Warhammer tends to reward dramatic action, heroic charges, epic duels, planetary invasions, all of the pomp and ceremony of war. Alfarius prefers positioning, preparation, information, the battle before the battle even occurs. I've always thought he would be utterly insufferable to play strategy games against, not because he would beat you, because 6 months later you'd discover how he'd managed to arrange the entire situation before the game had even begun. His mindset permeates everything about them. The Alpha Legion see warfare differently. It's not a contest of strength, it's more a contest of understanding. The side that understands reality most completely will win, at least in theory. The problem is that reality often becomes difficult to understand when everyone is lying, including yourself. And then comes perhaps the most controversial aspect of their story, which is the Cabal. And honestly, few plot lines in Warhammer generate more debate than this one, really. The Cabal presents Alfarius and Amegon with a horrifying choice: support Horus and allow Chaos to win. Humanity eventually burns itself out. Chaos starves and dies with it, or support the Emperor. Humanity survives, Chaos survives as well, and the war continues forever. At least according to the Cabal's predictions. Now, whether the Cabal was correct remains highly questionable, although you can't deny their logic, though their track record is not entirely flawless. But what interests me isn't whether they were right, it's why Alfarius listens to them. Because unlike many Primarchs, Alfarius is willing to sacrifice almost anything if he believes it serves a larger objective, including loyalties, reputations, possibly even himself. This is a dangerous mindset, potentially noble, but definitely dangerous, and it creates one of the greatest mysteries of the heresy. Did Alfarius truly betray the Emperor? Did Amegon? Were they secretly loyal, secretly traitor? Were they somehow both simultaneously? The answer depends on which source you trust, of course, which in Alpha Legion lore is essentially another way of saying nobody really knows. What makes the Alpha Legion fascinating is that they occupy a space between categories. Most Primarchs eventually become understandable. You may disagree with them, dislike them, but you can understand something of their character. Alfarius and Amigon remain elusive. The more information you seem to acquire, the less certain you become. And then comes the death of Alfarius, or perhaps the death of him. You see the problem here. According to Imperial records, as we know, Rogel Dawn kills Alfarius during the Heresy. A dramatic confrontation, perhaps a definitive moment, one Primarch slaying another. Pretty simple. Except nothing involving the Alpha Legion is ever simple, because Amigon still exists, and because the twins spend much of their lives pretending to be one another. And because Alpha Legion stories treat certainty with something to be dismantled rather than established. Even now, decades later, debates continue. Was Alfarius truly the one who died? Could he somehow have survived? Was it all a deception, substitution, sacrifice? The ambiguity remains. Again, exactly as intended. And then there is Amigon, the quieter brother, the less visible one, and in some ways the more interesting one. Because after Alfarius' apparent death, Amigon continues watching and planning and enduring. I've often wondered whether Amigon represents something Alfarius never quite managed. Doubt. Not weakness per se, but some kind of doubt. The willingness to question assumption. The willingness to potentially reconsider. The willingness to wonder whether the plan itself was flawed. If Alfarius embodies confidence, Amigon often feels more reflective, more cautious, perhaps more human. Though with Alpha Legion lore, even that interpretation comes wrapped in caveats. We arrive now at the modern setting, and honestly the Alpha Legion may be more relevant now than ever perhaps. The Imperium is fractured, communication unreliable, truth increasingly difficult to establish. Conspiracies flourish, information itself has become the battlefield. In other words, the galaxy has become an Alpha Legion paradise. This is one reason their eventual return feels almost inevitable, not merely because the fans want answers, because uncertainty itself has become central to the setting, and nobody represents uncertainty better than Alfarius and Amigon. Which brings us to the question, who were they? Traitors? Possibly. Loyalists? Possibly. Manipulators? Undoubtedly. Were they villains? Perhaps. I think you see the problem here. Every answer around them is incomplete, every conclusion suspicious, every certainty temporary. Because at their core, Alfarius and Amigon are not really characters about answers. They are characters about questions. Questions of identity, loyalty, truth. Questions of whether good intentions justify terrible action. The galaxy remembers the disguises, the infiltration, the conspiracies, the legendary phrase, "I am Alfarius." What people sometimes overlook is the tragedy hidden beneath all of this. The possibility that two Primarchs become so consumed by secrets that they lost any clear sense of what they were, who they were, what they were fighting for. The possibility that in trying to see every angle, they lost sight of the simplest of truths. The possibility that the greatest deception they ever constructed was the one they told themselves. And perhaps that is why Alfarius and Amigon remain so compelling. Because unlike every other Primarch, they never truly allow us to know them at all really. The Lion wears his armour, Russ wears his furs, Guilliman wears his responsibility. Alfarius and Amigon wear uncertainty itself. 10,000 years later, the mask remains firmly in place. The plans continue, the questions endure. And somewhere in the darkness of the far future, it is entirely possible that one of the Emperor's most enigmatic sons is still waiting, watching events unfold exactly as he intended, or perhaps exactly as he feared. With the Alpha Legion, those possibilities are often the same thing.